The black umbrella shuddered in the wind, as if it were trying to escape my fingers. The rain pounded on it with a persistence worthy of better use. As I watched the coffin sink into the ground, I felt nothing but a heavy emptiness and a vague irritation that the weather had made such a spectacle of itself. Tears streamed down the cheeks of the few people who had come to see Noel off on his final journey. My eyes remained dry. 42 years of marriage, 42 years, and now here I stand here in the Danville Cemetery, watching the earth take in the man I'd lived most of my life with. Pastor Sims mumbled something about reuniting in a better world, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the rain. I was 68. Noel had turned 71 just a month ago, when he was already lying in the hospital with tubes sticking out of every orifice of his pale body. My daughter stood a little further away, snuggled up to her husband. Prue was dressed impeccably today, a black dress that emphasized her still slender figure, a neat hat with a veil, low-heeled shoes. Leroy, her husband, supported her by the waist as if he feared she might faint from grief at any moment. The theater, all theater. I remember the day I met Noel. It was May 1998. He was working at the post office, and I had just gotten a job as an elementary teacher at Danville High. I went to mail a letter to my mother and saw him, a thin young man with a mop of unruly brown hair and a serious look in his brown eyes. He smiled at me, and it was so sincere, so warm, that I couldn't help but smile back. We were married a year later. It wasn't the violent passion they write about in books, but it was something much more precious, a quiet, secure happiness. Noel never aspired to more than he had. He was content with his job, his home, his life. Sometimes it annoyed me, his lack of ambition, his willingness to settle for little. But now, looking at his coffin, I think that perhaps he was wiser than I was. Prue was born 2 years after we were married, a small, screaming creature with blue eyes and blonde, almost white hair. Noel was enchanted by her at first sight. I remember him holding her in his arms, afraid to move for fear of hurting her. And there was so much love and tenderness in his eyes, it took my breath away. I closed my eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they kept coming, rolling in waves like the surf of the sea. Prue taking her first tentative steps, Prue stubbornly refusing to eat her vegetables, Prue crying over a broken doll. And then there was teenage Prue looking at us with disdain, Prue slamming the door after a fight, Prue demanding money for new clothes, for trips, for anything she could think of. When did everything change? When did our daughter turn into someone I barely recognized? Maybe it's our own fault. Noel was always spoiling her, couldn't say no to anything. And I just wanted her to be happy. Isn't that what every parent wants? Mom, Prue's voice snapped me out of my reverie. The funeral was over, and people were starting to leave. Are you okay? I looked at her. Her eyes were slightly red but dry. She'd learned to cry on demand when she was a baby. As soon as she wanted a new toy or candy, tears would spring to her eyes. Yes, I answered briefly. I'm fine. Leroy and I are going to take you home, she said in a tone that brooked no objection. I nodded. There was no point in arguing. Besides, I really didn't have the energy to drive. The drive home was silent. Prue sat in the front seat next to Leroy, occasionally casting glances at me through the rearview mirror. Leroy drove with exaggerated caution, as if he was afraid I might accuse him of disrespecting my husband's memory if he drove too fast. Our house, a two-story building with a veranda and garden, looked empty and abandoned, even though it had only been 2 weeks since Noel had last been here. I remember that day. He complained of a headache, and then he just collapsed, knocking over a glass of water. Stroke. The doctors said it was inevitable. His blood pressure, his weight, his age. Mom, are you sure you want to be alone? Prue asked as we entered the house. Leroy and I can spend the night here. No, I shook my head. I'm fine. I need to be alone. Leroy was shuffling from foot to foot in the hallway, clearly uncomfortable. We could help with dinner, he suggested. Or, something else. Thanks, but no. I tried to smile, but judging by the look on their faces, it wasn't very convincing. I just want to take a bath and go to bed. But, Mom, Prue started. Please, I didn't let her finish. I appreciate your concern, but right now I need to be alone. They left reluctantly, promising to stop by tomorrow. I closed the door behind them and leaned back against it, letting myself take a deep breath for the first time all day. The house was full of ghosts. Not literally, of course, but every corner, every object reminded me of Noel. His chair by the window, his old sweater thrown over the back of a chair, his books on the shelf in the living room. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the things he had last touched. Strangely, I didn't feel the sharp pain I expected, just fatigue and emptiness. In the bedroom, I took off my black dress and hung it carefully in the closet. Putting on an old house robe, I went down to the kitchen to make tea. While the water boiled, I looked out the window at our garden. Noel loved to tinker with plants. He had a light hand, as my mother used to say. Now the garden looked untended. Who would take care of it now? The tea was too hot and too strong, but I didn't care. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the file folder I'd brought from Noel's office. Insurance, bank statements, bills, will. Everything needed to be put in order. I picked up a pen and started making notes. My thoughts went back to Prue and Leroy. They had been unusually attentive the last few months. Prue called every day. Leroy offered to help with chores. They invited us over for dinner every week. At first, I thought they were just concerned about Noel's health. He was already having heart problems, and the doctor had warned of possible complications. But there was something else in their behavior, something that made me wary. I remembered catching Prue in Noel's office one day. She was standing by his desk, looking over some papers. When I walked in, she flinched and quickly folded the papers. "What are you doing?" I asked then. "Just helping Daddy sort through some papers," she answered with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "He asked me to check the accounts. I didn't believe her then, but I didn't insist. Noel didn't like it when we fought with Prue, and lately he'd been so tired and irritable." The ringing of the phone interrupted my musings. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. Who could be calling this late? Hello? I picked up the phone, expecting to hear the voice of Prue, who, despite my pleas, had decided to check on me. But there was silence. Hello? I repeated louder. There was a quiet click, and the call was cut off. I hung up slowly, feeling a chill run down my spine. Maybe it was just a mistaken call, or maybe someone I knew wanted to offer condolences, but changed their mind, deciding it wasn't the right time. I went back to the paperwork, but my mind didn't want to focus on the numbers and dates. Instead, I thought back to Noel's last days in the hospital. Prue had been there all the time, fussing over him, adjusting pillows, talking to the doctors. Leroy came by often too, bringing fruit and magazines that Noel never read. They were the perfect daughter and son-in-law, caring, attentive, willing to help. And yet, I remember leaving the ward one evening to buy coffee from the vending machine at the end of the hallway. As I was walking back, I heard their voices, Prue and Leroy. They were talking quietly, but the sound carried pretty well in the empty hallway. "He won't sign," Leroy said. "You can see the state he's in." "He will," Prue said with confidence. "I know how to convince him." "What about your mother? She's not stupid, Prue." "She's too upset to notice anything. Besides, she's always let Daddy handle the finances. She's not gonna get involved. I froze, not knowing what to do. What were they talking about? What was Noel supposed to sign? I took a few steps back, then coughed loudly and continued walking as if I had just stepped off the elevator. When I entered the room, Prue was sitting at Noel's bedside, holding his hand, and Leroy was standing at the window, looking out at the parking lot below. They both smiled at me, and in that moment their smiles seemed predatory. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about the conversation I had overheard. What were they up to? I always knew Prue liked money more than she should, but could she really? No, I didn't even want to think about it. This is my daughter, my flesh and blood. She couldn't be that heartless, and yet the doubts kept me in suspense. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Noel was alone. Prue was usually there by 10. He looked pale and haggard, but his eyes were clear. Muriel, he smiled when he saw me. You're early today. I kissed his forehead and sat next to him, taking his hand in mine. How do you feel? Like a man who doesn't have long to live, he replied with a crooked smile. Don't say that. I squeezed his hand. We both know the truth, Muriel. There's no point in pretending. I looked at him, at the man I'd lived with for most of my conscious life, and felt my heart clench with pain and fear. Noel, I began cautiously, has Prue asked you to sign anything lately? He frowned, trying to remember. Dash. Yes, some papers from the bank. She said it was just a formality, something to do with our joint account. Did you sign it? Not yet. I said I wanted to read it first. She promised to bring glasses today. I felt a chill run down my spine. Prue knew that Noel had always been pedantic about documents. He never signed anything without reading it at least twice. She should have realized he wouldn't sign anything without his glasses. I don't think you should sign anything now, I said quietly. Wait until you're feeling better. He gave me a long look. Do you know something, Muriel? I didn't want to upset him, didn't want his last days to be clouded by suspicions about his own daughter. But I also couldn't let Prue manipulate him like that. I just think any financial decisions can wait until you're out of the hospital, I said, trying to sound casual. Prue said it was urgent. His voice was weak, but I could hear the concern in it. Nothing can be that urgent. I stroked his hand. Rest and don't think about it now. He nodded, closing his eyes. After a few minutes, his breathing became even. He had fallen asleep. I sat beside him, looking at his face, so familiar and so foreign at the same time. Wrinkles, gray hair, sunken cheeks. The disease had changed him, made him look like an old man, although in my memory he always remained that young letter carrier with a warm smile. The door of the room opened and Prue walked in. She looked flawless as always, perfectly styled hair, understated makeup, expensive but not garish clothes. Dash, Mom? She smiled at me. You're early today. I couldn't sleep, I replied, not taking my eyes off Noel's face. She walked over to the bed, looking at her sleeping father. How is he? Tired and weak. Prue nodded, pulling out a pair of glasses from her bag in a case. I brought his glasses. He asked for them yesterday. I took the case from her hands. I'll tell him when he wakes up, I said, putting the glasses in my bag. She looked at me with slight irritation, but didn't say anything. Instead, she sat down on the chair on the other side of the bed and pulled out her phone. I watched her, trying to see my little girl in this beautiful, well-groomed woman. But she had disappeared long ago, leaving behind only memories and pictures in albums. That night, Noel died, quietly, in his sleep, without agony. The doctor said it was a mercy. His body just gave up, tired of fighting. I was sitting next to him, holding his hand, when the heart rhythm monitor showed a straight line. Prue wasn't there. She'd gone home hours ago, saying she had to check on something at work. I hadn't cried. Not then, not at the funeral, not now, sitting at the kitchen table with tea cooling and papers spread out in front of me. Perhaps the tears would come later. Or maybe I'd already cried them all in the weeks I'd watched life slowly leave the man I loved. The phone rang again. This time, I just stared at it without moving. After the fifth ring, the answering machine came on, and I heard Leroy's voice. Muriel, it's Leroy. Prue and I would like to stop by tomorrow morning. There are some things we need to discuss. Call me when you wake up. The answering machine clicked, and there was silence again. I stared at the flashing red light indicating a new message. There are some things we need to discuss. I could almost envision what it would be about, and I knew I needed to be prepared. I gathered my papers and went upstairs. In the bedroom, I opened the safe hidden behind a painting, an old-fashioned solution. But Noel had always been a traditionalist. Inside were our most important documents: the marriage certificate, Prue's birth certificate, insurance policies, and, of course, the will. I pulled it out and reread it again, even though I knew the contents by heart. It was clear and simple. The house and most of the savings were left to me. Prue would get a certain amount of money and a few family heirlooms. I put the will back in the safe and locked it. Then I went to bed, alone in this room for the first time in years. Strangely, I didn't feel lonely. Perhaps because I knew the real battle was just beginning. The morning after the funeral greeted me with a headache and a ringing doorbell. I threw on my robe and took my time walking down the stairs. Standing outside the door, as I'd expected, were Prue and Leroy. My daughter looked flawless even at 9 in the morning, hair styled, makeup understated, but immaculate. Leroy held a paper bag with the logo of a local bakery. Mom, Prue pecked my cheek, we brought breakfast. You probably haven't eaten anything since yesterday. I wanted to object, but my stomach rumbled treacherously. Indeed, the last thing I'd eaten at the memorial dinner was a few spoonfuls of potato salad and a slice of pie from my neighbor, Mrs. Hutchins. Thank you, I stepped back, letting them into the house. I was just about to make coffee. I'll make it, Prue said quickly, heading into the kitchen. You get dressed in the meantime, Mom. I didn't like her commanding tone, but I was too tired to argue. I went upstairs, took a quick shower, and put on a simple navy blue dress. When I returned to the kitchen, Prue was arranging plates of scones and croissants on the table, and Leroy was pouring coffee into cups. Everything looks delicious, I said, sitting down at the table. Blueberry scones are your favorite, Prue smiled. I looked at her in surprise. Did Prue remember what kind of scones I liked? Over the past few years, she and I had socialized mostly around holidays and family occasions. In those rare moments when she called or stopped by, the conversation usually centered around her problems and needs. That she was suddenly showing such concern was unusual, to say the least. We ate in silence. Leroy glanced furtively at his watch, while Prue methodically cut her croissant into tiny pieces, barely touching the food. Finally, she put down her fork and straightened up. Mom, we need to talk about some things. I took a sip of coffee, waiting for her to continue. Leroy and I have discussed the situation, she continued, avoiding my gaze, and we think it's going to be hard for you to manage this big house on your own. Maybe we should consider selling it. I almost choked on my coffee. Sell the house? I've lived here almost 40 years, Prue. Yeah, but you realize that's unsustainable, Leroy interjected. A big house that requires constant maintenance, a garden, and real estate prices are good now. You could buy a cozy apartment close to us and still have enough left for a secure old age. I looked at them, not believing my ears. It had only been 2 days since Noel had died, and they were already planning to sell the house where he'd raised his daughter? I'm not moving anywhere, I said firmly. and I'm not going to sell the house. Prue's face took on an expression I remembered well from her teenage years, a mixture of irritation and stubbornness. Mom, be reasonable. You're 68 years old. You can't take care of the house by yourself. Who's going to fix a leaky roof or cut the grass? I'll hire people if I have to, I answered calmly. Your father and I have enough savings. That's what we wanted to talk about, too. Leroy coughed. About financial matters. I held up my hand, stopping him. Not now. I just buried my husband. Let's put off talking about money for at least a week. Prue and Leroy exchanged glances. All right, Prue agreed grudgingly, but we'll still need to talk about it. Dad left some instructions. I nodded without saying a word. Did they think I didn't know? That I was so blind and naive? Even 3 months ago, I'd suspected something was wrong. And it wasn't just that overheard conversation at the hospital. It started about 6 months before Noel died. He already had health problems, high blood pressure, chest pains, frequent dizziness. Doctors warned of the possibility of a stroke or heart attack if he didn't change his lifestyle. But Noel was stubborn. He refused to diet, continued to drink his glass of whiskey every night, and was unwilling to give up the cigars he smoked on special occasions. During that period, Prue began to take an unusual interest in our finances. She often made small talk about how much the house was worth, what our savings were, whether we had stocks or other investments. Noel answered evasively. He'd always been secretive about money, even with me. But Prue was persistent. One day I came back from the store earlier than usual. I'd forgotten my shopping list and decided to go back for it. As I entered the house, I heard voices coming from Noel's study. The door was ajar, and I could see Prue standing over her father sitting in the chair, holding some papers. It's just a precaution, Dad, she said. At your age, you have to be prepared for anything. Mom doesn't know anything about finances. You always said so yourself. Noel looked tired and a little confused. I have to show this to Muriel first, he said, taking the papers from his daughter's hands. Why bother her? Prue sounded annoyed. She'll only get upset, start thinking the worst. You know how suspicious she is. I froze in the hallway, not knowing what to do. Of course, I could have gone in and asked what they were talking about. But something held me back. Perhaps an instinct for self-preservation, or just a reluctance to make a scene. Instead, I quietly walked back to the front door, opened and closed it noisily as if I'd just walked in, and then called out loudly, "Noel! Prue! I'm home!" When I entered the study, the papers were gone, and Prue was sitting on the edge of the desk, chatting casually with her father about some nonsense. But I noticed the tension in their postures, the unnaturalness of their smiles. Something was definitely wrong. After Prue left, I asked Noel about the papers. He brushed it off, saying it was just some tax return formalities. I pretended to believe him, but the anxiety never left me. The next day, I took advantage of the fact that Noel had gone for his usual walk in the park and searched his office. The papers Prue had shown him were in the top drawer of his desk. It was a new will, quite different from the one we'd made a few years ago after the grandchildren were born. In this version, the house and most of the savings went to Prue, and I was left only a small amount of money and some of Noel's personal belongings. The document wasn't signed, but it bore the seal of a law firm we'd never done business with. I was shocked. Did Noel really want to change the will in his daughter's favor, depriving me of the home I'd lived in most of my life? Or was Prue somehow manipulating him, taking advantage of his weakened state? I decided not to confront directly. Instead, I called Wesley Abbott, our old friend and part-time notary who had drawn up our original will. Wesley was an older man, almost the same age as Noel, with a serious look from beneath his thick gray eyebrows and a reputation for honesty and integrity. We met in a small cafe on the outskirts of Danville, away from prying eyes. Muriel, you look worried, Wesley said when we ordered coffee. What's wrong? I told him everything. About Prue's strange behavior, about the conversation I'd overheard, about the new will I'd found. Wesley listened attentively, nodding from time to time. When I finished, he tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. This is serious, Muriel. If Noel signs this new will and it's properly probated, the previous one is automatically revoked. But why would Noel want to change his will? I still couldn't believe my husband could do this to me. Maybe he doesn't want to. Wesley leaned closer. You say his health has declined in recent months? He could be affected, especially if Prue presents it as concern for you or the family's future. I remembered how tired and confused Noel looked that day in the study. What should I do? Talk to him, Wesley advised. Straightforward and honest. Ask him why he wants to change the will. What if he says it's his conscious decision? Wesley shrugged. Then you'll have to accept it. But I've known Noel for almost 40 years. He's not the kind of man who would leave his wife homeless. I came home determined to talk to Noel. But when I saw him, napping in his chair with a book in his lap, so vulnerable and aged, my resolve wavered. How could I upset him, who was already worn down by illness? What if talking to him would trigger another attack? I put the conversation on hold, determined to wait for the right moment. But that moment never came. The next day, Noel had his first micro stroke. The doctor said it was a warning. The next one could be much more serious. He was hospitalized for a week and then released home with a long list of medications and recommendations. Prue was tirelessly by his side the whole time, sitting at her father's bedside in the hospital, chatting with doctors, ordering medications, and she kept coming after Noel was discharged every day, often with papers that required his signature. I called Wesley again and made an appointment, but this time I asked him to come to our house. He showed up 2 days later with a briefcase full of papers. Noel has to be of sound mind to deal with these things, Wesley said when we were alone in the kitchen. If there's any doubt about his capacity, we can challenge any document he signs now. Noel was surprised by Wesley's visit, but excited about the opportunity to talk to a longtime friend. After exchanging pleasantries, Wesley carefully turned the conversation to business matters. Noel, Muriel is worried about your will, he said bluntly. She says Prue suggested you sign a new one? Noel frowned, casting a quick glance in my direction. Yes. She said it was to protect Muriel if anything happened to me. Did you read the documents? Wesley asked. Not all of them, Noel admitted. Prue said it was urgent, but I insisted on reading everything before signing. She kept promising to bring my glasses. Wesley nodded, pulling a folder of papers out of his briefcase. Minus Muriel showed me a copy of that document. It's a new will that leaves the house and most of the savings to Prue, leaving Muriel with almost nothing. Noel looked shocked. It's impossible. I would never agree to that. That's why I'm here, Wesley said calmly, to help you update a real will that reflects your true wishes. We spent the next hour discussing the details of the new document. According to the updated will, I would receive the house and the bulk of my savings, while Prue would receive a fixed amount of money. Wesley also suggested including a clause stating that any subsequent wills had to be probated either by him personally or by a certain notary from his office, or they would be considered invalid. Noel signed the documents in the presence of Wesley and 2 witnesses, his employees who had come specifically for this purpose. Wesley took the original will to his office for safekeeping and left us a certified copy. When Prue came in the next day with a new stack of papers, Noel refused to even look at them. I already updated the will yesterday, he said firmly, with Wesley Abbott. Prue froze, Her face contorted with rage for a moment before she pulled herself together. What? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you consult me? Because it's my decision, Prue, Noel replied with an uncharacteristic firmness. I'm still the head of this family. She made you do it. Prue turned to me, her eyes burning with anger. You've always turned him against me. Prue, I tried to speak calmly. Your father made this decision on his own, and it's only fair that you get your share. Liar! She was practically screaming. You're manipulating him by taking advantage of his illness. That's enough. Noel tried to stand up, but swayed and sank heavily back into his chair. I will not tolerate such a tone in my house. If you can't behave respectfully, you'd better leave. Prue turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard that the window panes rattled. Noel and I sat in silence, shocked by her reaction. I'm sorry, Noel said finally. I didn't realize she was so. He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. It hurt both of us to admit that our daughter had been willing to cheat on her parents for money. After that incident, Prue didn't show up for a few days. Then she came back with apologies and gifts. She was the sweetest, most caring person I'd ever met, but I could see the falseness in her smile, the cold calculation in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. A week later, Noel had a second stroke, a much more serious one. He lost the ability to speak and could barely move the right side of his body. The doctors were cautious in their prognosis, but gave no hope of a full recovery. Prue was by his side again all the time, in the hospital and then at home when Noel was discharged. She helped care for him, gave him his medication, read him the papers. From the outside, she looked like the perfect daughter. But I could see the impatience in her movements, the irritation she hid behind fake smiles, and she kept bringing in papers to sign, bills, insurance forms, bank documents. I checked each paper before I let Noel put his ragged signature, or, more often than not, just a fingerprint. Prue was clearly annoyed by my vigilance, but there was nothing she could do about it. When Noel died, I was prepared for what would follow. I knew Prue wouldn't give up so easily. And now she and Leroy were sitting at my kitchen table, pretending to care, trying to convince me to sell the house. I could see the greed in their eyes, hear the falseness in their words. Would you consider selling? Prue asked, pretending it was just a friendly suggestion. Of course I'll think about it, I lied with a smile. But not right now. I need time to get used to the idea of Noel being gone. Of course, Prue patted my arm with feigned concern. We just wanted you to know we're here for you, ready to help, with anything. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Anything like selling the house and splitting the proceeds? Or finding a suitable nursing home where I could live out my days quietly while they enjoyed my money? After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about what had happened in the last few months, about Prue's attempts to manipulate her sick father, about her fake concern, about her greed, about how she'd tried to trick us by getting Noel to sign a fake will, about how much more aggressive she became after Noel and I upset her plans. I wasn't naive. I knew that Prue and Leroy wouldn't stop. They would think of something else, find a new way to try and get what they thought was rightfully theirs. But I was ready. I had a real will, safely in Wesley's possession. I had the truth on my side. I stood up, poured myself a cup of fresh tea, and walked to the window. It was starting to rain outside, the same rain that had fallen later at Noel's funeral. I watched the drops dripping down the glass and thought about the fact that the battle was just beginning, and I was determined to win it, no matter what it took. The 3 days after the funeral passed in a strange daze. I walked around the house, mechanically doing the daily chores, cooking meals I hardly ate, washing dishes I hardly used, dusting furniture that barely made an appearance. Prue called every day, asking how I was feeling, if I needed help. I answered in one-word answers, saying I was doing fine, thanking her for caring. We both knew it was just a game. The fourth day after the funeral, I decided to sort through Noel's things. It wasn't that I was ready for it, it was just that I needed something to do so I wouldn't go crazy with the silence in the house. I started with his closet, shirts, pants, sweaters, neatly folded and hung as if waiting for their owner. I put them in cardboard boxes I found in the garage, planning to take them to the homeless center later. Noel would approve. In the pocket of one of his jackets, I found a note written in his handwriting. Wesley Abbott, Friday, 2 o'clock. The date was stamped a week before his first stroke. I smiled even in small things. Noel was prudent, always planning ahead. It was that character trait that had saved our inheritance from Prue's greedy hands. As I crossed to his office, the phone rang. It was Wesley. Muriel. His voice sounded concerned. "How are you?" "Alive," I answered honestly. "I'm going through Noel's things." "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this," he said, "but I need to talk to you. It's about the will." I tensed. "What's wrong?" "It's better to discuss it in person. Could I come over today?" "Of course," I agreed. "Anytime." "I'll be there in an hour," Wesley said and hung up. I sank into Noel's chair, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Had something happened to the will? Maybe Prue had somehow gotten to it? No, that's impossible. Wesley is too careful and principled. But then what? Wesley arrived exactly an hour later, as promised. He looked tired, anxiety written all over his face. I ushered him into the living room and offered him tea, which he politely declined. "Muriel," he began without preamble. "Prue came to see me." I nodded, unsurprised. "E?" She showed me a document, supposedly Noel's new will, drawn up a week before he died. I felt a chill run down my spine. "It's a forgery," I said firmly. "I know," Wesley nodded. "The signature is very similar but not identical. Besides, I remember the state Noel was in the week before he died. He could barely hold a pen, let alone write his signature." "What did she say?" "That Noel changed his mind, that he was afraid you wouldn't be able to administer the estate, that he wanted to secure his daughter's future." Wesley shook his head. "The usual manipulative nonsense. And what did you tell her?" "That I kept the original will, properly authenticated, with witnesses' signatures, and that if she wanted to contest it, she'd have to do it through the courts." Wesley smiled slightly. She wasn't happy. I pictured Prue's face at that moment, a mixture of rage and disappointment. It almost made me smile. "Thank you, Wesley." "You're welcome." He stood up, getting ready to leave. "But be prepared, Muriel. She's not going to stop that easily." I nodded. I knew Prue better than anyone. She was stubborn, determined, and utterly ruthless when it came to what she thought was rightfully hers. And the house, our savings, Noel's entire inheritance, she considered it hers. I wasn't wrong. The next day, Prue and Leroy arrived unannounced. I saw their car pull up in front of the house as I stood at the living room window with a cup of tea. They got out of the car with a determined look. Prue in an elegant black dress, Leroy in a strict suit, as if they were going to a business meeting rather than visiting a grieving mother. I met them at the door without giving them a chance to ring the bell. "Prue? Leroy?" I nodded. "What a surprise." "Mom." Prue tried to smile, but it came out strained. "We thought we'd stop by and check on you." "As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," I replied, not moving from my seat to let them pass. Leroy coughed. "Muriel, we need to talk. It's important." I looked at them both, sighed, and stepped back. "Come in." They walked into the living room, where Prue immediately noticed the boxes of Noel's things. "What are these?" she asked with genuine surprise. "Your father's things," I answered. "I'm going to give them to the needy." What? Prue looked indignant. Without consulting me? They're my memories too, Mom. I almost laughed. In her entire adult life, Prue had never once expressed interest in her father's old sweaters or shirts. But now they were suddenly her memories. If you want to keep something as a memento, pick one, I said calmly. The rest I'll give away. Prue opened her mouth to object, but Leroy put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. That's not why we're here, he said, pulling a folded document from his inside jacket pocket. Muriel, we need to discuss this. He unfolded the paper and placed it on the coffee table. It was the same will Wesley had mentioned printed on official letterhead, with a signature very similar to Noel's, but a little smoother, a little more confident than a terminally ill person might write. What is it? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Dad's last will and testament, Prue said, looking me straight in the eye. He'd made it a week before he died. With me. Interesting. I took the document in my hands, pretending to scrutinize it. What did it say? Dad wanted the house to pass to me, Prue said with certainty. He was worried that it would be too hard for you to keep it on your own. You get enough money to buy an apartment close to us and live comfortably. I continued to look at the document, noting details, the date, the signature of a notary I'd never met, the absence of witnesses' signatures. And who authorized this will? I asked innocently. A notary from a new law firm downtown? Leroy answered quickly. A highly respected professional. And the witnesses? They signed on the other page. Leroy began nervously. It's standard practice. I nodded, returning the document to the table. I see. And when do you plan to inherit? Prue and Leroy exchanged quick glances. Mom, you don't understand. Prue leaned forward. This is not a matter of planning. According to this will, I'm already an heiress. The house is mine now. I'm the lady of the house now. Her voice sounded louder and more confident than before, as if she were asserting her authority by saying those words. Leroy straightened up beside her, looking at me arrogantly, and waved the document in the air. It's all legal, Muriel, he added with a smug smile. We'll give you a month to pack your things and find a new place to live. We're not heartless. We understand that you need time. I looked at them both, my daughter and her husband, so confident of their victory, so proud of their cunning. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I could have gotten angry, I could have screamed and accused them of lying and cheating, but instead I felt a strange calmness. It's an interesting document, I said, rising, but unfortunately it's not legally binding. Prue frowned. What do you mean? I mean that your father's real will, made and signed by him in the presence of two witnesses 3 months before his death, is in the possession of Wesley Abbott, a notary public, and according to that will, the house and most of the savings are left to me. Prue's face turned pale, then red with anger. That's impossible. Papa would never. Dad did exactly that, I interrupted her. After he discovered you were trying to manipulate him into signing a fake will. You're lying. Prue jumped to her feet. You've always been against me, always trying to turn Dad against me. Prue, I kept my composure even though I was seething inside. You brought your sick father a document according to which I, his wife of almost 40 years, was to remain almost without means of subsistence. You tried to deceive him by taking advantage of his weakness. What did you expect? That I would just let it happen? Leroy looked confused, his self-confidence evaporating. But the will, dash. He looked at the document he was still holding. It's a forgery, and you both know it, I said firmly. The signature is fake. The notary is probably fake, too. In the last week before he died, Noel could barely speak, let alone write, Any court of law would recognize this as a forgery. You can't prove that, Prue shouted, but there was desperation in her voice. I can, I shrugged. Wesley has medical records that prove your father's condition at the time. I have witnesses, doctors, nurses, neighbors who saw him, and of course the original will with his actual signature. Prue looked at me with hatred. You planned this whole thing, didn't you? Right from the start, pretending you didn't suspect anything while I did what I had to do to protect myself and your father's will, I replied. What did you expect, Prue? That I would blindly trust you after everything you've done? After everything I've done? Prue laughed, but it was a cold, unpleasant laugh. What about what you have done? All my life, you and my father have controlled me, told me how to live my life, criticized my every decision. We supported you, I countered, feeling my irritation growing. We paid for your education, helped you with the down payment on your house, gave you money when you got into financial difficulties. We were always there for you. Yes, with perpetual lectures and disappointed looks. Prue was practically screaming now. Why can't you be like Nancy from next door? Why don't you study better? We've invested so much in you, and you. I remembered these phrases. They really rang true in our house. Noel, frustrated by Prue's next prank, her grades, or her behavior, would say something similar. Me too, I'll admit it. We wanted the best for her, wanted her to realize her potential. But maybe our methods weren't always the right ones. We loved you, Prue, I said quietly. We wanted you to be happy. No, she shook her head. You wanted me to be what you saw me as, obedient, diligent, grateful. You never accepted me for who I was. I wanted to object, but stopped myself. Was there any truth in what she said? Perhaps, but it didn't justify what she was trying to do. Was that why you decided to deceive your sick father? I asked. To get him to sign a fake will, and when that failed, to forge his signature? Is this your revenge for our parenting mistakes? Prue didn't answer, only pressed her lips into a thin line. Leroy, who had been silent all this time, finally intervened. Look, let's discuss this calmly. Surely we can come to some compromise. What kind of compromise are you suggesting, Leroy? I asked, turning to him. Split the house in half? Or maybe I should give up my share of the inheritance in favor of you two out of guilt for being an imperfect mother. He looked confused. Well, maybe not so radical, but there's no buts. I was firm. Noel's will is clear and legal. The house and most of the savings stay with me. Prue gets her share, a substantial sum of money, which I'll pay to her as soon as all the formalities are settled. That's not fair, Prue exclaimed. This house was supposed to be mine. I'm his daughter, his heiress, and I'm his wife, I replied calmly. The woman he'd lived with for almost 40 years, the woman who was by his side until the end, who nursed him when he was sick, the woman he wanted to protect from situations like this. You turned him against me. Prue sounded bitter in her voice. You always have. No, Prue, I shook my head. You turned him against you by your own actions. He saw what you were trying to do, and he was disappointed, deeply disappointed that his daughter was willing to leave his wife homeless. Prue stared at me for several long seconds, then turned sharply toward Leroy. Let's get out of here. There's nothing for us to do here. Leroy looked uncertain. But Prue, maybe we should. I said, let's go. She was already heading for the door. Leroy threw me an apologetic look and followed her. I stayed standing in the middle of the living room, listening to the front door slam, the engine of their car starting, the tires rustling on the gravel of the driveway. Only when the sound of the engine faded into the distance did I let myself sink into the chair and exhale. The battle had been won, but the war, I knew, had only just begun. Prue wouldn't give up so easily. She would find another way, another strategy. She had always done that, ever since she was a little girl. When she didn't get what she wanted, she would just change tactics, but never give up on her goal. I remembered when little Prue wanted a doll that Noel and I thought was too expensive and inappropriate for her age. We had said no. She cried, threw tantrums, refused to eat, to no avail. Then she changed her approach. She became a model girl, helped around the house, got good grades. We were so happy about the change that we bought her that doll for her birthday. She smiled and thanked us, and then I overheard her saying to her friend, "See? I told you I was going to get it. You just have to know how to manipulate adults." She was 8 years old. Nothing has changed since then. Prue had always gotten what she wanted, one way or the other. And now she wanted the house, the inheritance, everything Noel had left behind. Not because of sentimental attachment to her ancestral home, not because of the memory of her father, but simply because she felt she deserved it, that it was hers by right. I got up and walked over to the bar that Noel and I rarely used. There was a bottle of whiskey that Noel opened on special occasions. I poured some into a glass and took a sip, wincing at the pungent taste. Noel always said whiskey was an acquired taste. I'd never acquired it over the years, preferring softer drinks. But right now, I needed something strong, something to dull the pain of realizing that my own daughter hated me enough to be willing to leave me homeless. I looked at the family photo on the mantelpiece. The three of us against the lake. Prue is about 12 years old. She's laughing. Noelle has her arms around both of us. I'm smiling at the camera. We look happy, the perfect family. When did it all go wrong? Where did we make a mistake? A phone call interrupts my musings. I walked over to the receiver, expecting to hear Wesley's voice, maybe, or one of the neighbors wondering how I was doing. Dash dash hello? You're gonna regret this. Prue's voice was cold and full of rage. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll get what's rightfully mine. Prue. But she had already hung up. I slowly returned the phone to the base, feeling my hands shaking. Not from fear, but from grief. The realization that it was over between us, that my daughter, my only child, had declared war on me. I walked back to the chair and sat down, clutching the glass of whiskey in my hands. The house was quiet, just the ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the distant noise of cars passing by broke the silence. This house, Noel's and my home, had become a battlefield. A battle I hadn't started, but I was ready to continue. All these years I'd given in, compromised, forgiven. I turned a blind eye to Prue's selfishness, to her manipulations, to her lies. I've excused her behavior, found explanations, blamed myself. But now I saw her for what she was, greedy, selfish, willing to do anything for money, and I wasn't going to give in anymore. Not this time. I finished my whiskey and set the glass on the table. Then I picked up my cell phone and dialed Wesley's number. Wesley? It's Muriel. They were here with the fake will. Yeah, I told them the truth. No, they didn't take it well. Yeah, I think we should prepare for the possibility that they might contest the will in court. Thank you, Wesley. I know I can count on you. After talking to Wesley, I felt more confident. I was ready to fight, and I knew I had the truth on my side. Noel wanted me to keep the house, to be protected, and I wouldn't let anyone, not even my own daughter, break his last will. I went back to the boxes of Noel's things, continuing to sort. This simple, mechanical work helped me to think, to organize my thoughts. I knew Prue wouldn't stop. She would find a way to attack again, perhaps through the courts, perhaps some other way. But I was ready. I had a real will, properly probated. I had the truth, and I had a determination I hadn't felt in years. Prue was right about one thing. I'd always defer to her, always compromise, always try to smooth over conflicts. But not this time. Not when it came to Noel's last will and testament, the house he and I had lived in for most of our lives. That was a line I wouldn't let her cross. I looked at the picture on the mantel once more, at our smiling faces, at the semblance of a happy family. Perhaps it had always been only an illusion. Maybe Prue had always been like this, calculating, selfish, manipulative, and maybe it's time to accept that. To accept that my daughter is not who I wanted her to be, who I thought she was all these years. To accept that there is a chasm between us that can never be bridged. I spent a restless night after the confrontation with Prue and Leroy. The dreams were disturbing, confusing, scraps of memories mixed with fantasies. In one, Noel sat in his chair, alive and well, and said, "I always knew this would happen one day." I woke up at first light, feeling tired, as if I hadn't slept at all. The morning coffee, drunk in the quiet of the kitchen, cleared my thoughts a little. I thought about how we'd gotten to this point, how my only daughter had turned into a person willing to deceive her own parents, to forge a will, to leave her mother homeless. It didn't happen overnight, of course. It was a long, gradual process, stretching over decades. Prue had always been a difficult child. Not that difficult, no. She did well in school, didn't get involved with bad company, didn't get into drugs or alcohol like many of her peers. But there had always been something about her, calculating. It was as if she was constantly evaluating what was more profitable, obedience or rebellion, tears or smiles, truth or lies. I remembered an incident when she was 15. She wanted a new dress for the school prom, an expensive one from a famous designer. Noel and I said it was too extravagant for a teenager, suggested a more modest option. She didn't argue, didn't throw a tantrum. She just nodded and went to her room. A few days later, we discovered that our credit card had been used to buy that very dress. Prue swore she hadn't taken the card. Maybe it was identity theft or a store error. We almost believed it until we found the dress hidden in her closet. When we confronted her with the evidence, she confessed but didn't apologize. Instead, she said, "I knew you wouldn't buy it for me. I had to act on my own." We punished her, of course. Took back the dress, returned the money, deprived her of pocket money for a month. But I remember the look on her face, not remorse, but rather annoyance that her plan hadn't worked. It was the first serious wake-up call, but by no means the last. When Prue went to college, Noel and I agreed to pay for her tuition and modest housing. She chose business administration, a practical choice that we approved of. For the first year, everything went well. She called regularly, came in on weekends, and showed good grades. But then the calls started asking for more money. For textbooks, which suddenly went up in price, or for a computer that accidentally broke, or for medical bills after some minor injury. We believed, sent the money without asking too many questions. Until one day, we got a call from the college administration. Prue owed tuition for the entire semester. How could that be? I mean, we'd been transferring money into her account regularly. Turns out Prue had found another use for those funds. She started dating a guy from a rich family and spent it all on expensive clothes, restaurants, gifts for him, trying to match his lifestyle. When we asked how she could be so irresponsible with her education, she said, "You don't understand. Connections in this world mean more than a diploma. I invested in my future. We paid the debt, of course. What else could we do?" But from then on, the tuition money went directly to the college, not to her. This angered her. She felt humiliated, said we didn't trust her, that we were treating her like a child. But there was no choice. That guy, by the way, left her after a few months. The investment didn't pay off. After college, Prue moved to Chicago. She talked about great opportunities, a career in finance, how quickly she would move up the ladder. We were excited. She was finally picking up her brain, starting to think about the future. Her first job was promising, a junior manager in an investment company. The salary was modest, but with prospects for growth. Prue rented a small apartment, bought a used car, and began to live independently. Noel and I were proud. Maybe all our educational efforts were not wasted. But 6 months later, the trouble started. Prue called crying. She'd been fired. Through no fault of her own, of course, but because of layoffs. The company had fallen on hard times. She looked for a new job, but to no avail. Her savings were dwindling. She couldn't pay the rent. So we sent her some money to help her through the hard times. A month later, more, then more. When asked how her job search was going, she answered vaguely. Interviews were unsuccessful, or the salary was too low, or the job didn't match her qualifications. One day, Noel couldn't stand it and went to Chicago, ostensibly on business, but actually to check up on her. He came back more gloomy than a cloud. Turns out Prue wasn't looking for a job at all. She was dating a new boyfriend, a successful Wall Street trader who was often in Chicago on business. They went out to restaurants, clubs, and visited expensive stores. The money we sent for rent and food went to very different purposes. When Noel asked her about it directly, she didn't deny it. "You don't understand, Dad," she said. "Brad can open the doors to the financial world for me. One call from him and I can get my dream job. But I have to look the right way, have to go to the right places, meet the right people." Noel was furious. He told her that we were cutting off financial support, that she was an adult and needed to learn to live within her means, that she could come home if she wanted and look for a job in Danville, but would not get any more money for her investment in the future. She took offense, of course, said we never understood her, never really supported her, that we were small, limited people, unable to think big, that she could do it on her own. We haven't heard from her in almost a year. No phone calls, no letters, nothing. I was worried. I wanted to call, but Noel was adamant that she had to make the first move on her own. She has to realize that actions have consequences. She called on Christmas Day. Her voice was quiet, depressed. She apologized, saying she was wrong, that she understood our frustration, that she'd learned a lot this year, that she'd become more responsible, that she'd found a steady job, that she missed us very much. We invited her to the holidays. She arrived, thin, with dark circles under her eyes, but with a smile on her face. She told us about her new job, assistant manager in a small real estate company, about her small but cozy apartment, about her new friends, more serious and purposeful than the previous company, about plans for the future, modest, realistic. We believed, of course, wanted to believe. We hoped that she had really grown up, realized her mistakes, got on the right path. She left after the new year, leaving us with a warm sense of reconciliation and hope. We started communicating regularly again, weekly calls, stories about work, about everyday life. Everything seemed normal, stable. And then, about 6 months later, she arrived with news. She had met the one. Leroy Barkley, a successful insurance appraiser, smart, reliable, with good prospects. They've only been dating for 3 months, but they're already thinking about getting married. We were surprised at the rush, but Prue was glowing with happiness. Leroy made a good impression on us. Polite, confident, a little pompous, but overall a nice young man. When they announced their engagement, we congratulated them wholeheartedly. The wedding was supposed to be modest, a small ceremony, dinner for close friends and family, but the closer the date got, the grander Prue's plans became. First, she talked about 50 guests, then 100. Instead of a simple dinner at a local restaurant, she suddenly wanted a banquet at a country club. Instead of a modest dress, she wanted a designer outfit. Instead of a honeymoon in a neighboring state, a trip to Europe. When we asked how they planned to pay for all this, Prue said they were counting on our help. After all, we are her parents, and traditionally, the bride's parents pay for the wedding. Noel reminded us that we'd never been rich. He'd worked all his life at the post office. I'd worked as an elementary school teacher. We had savings, but not significant enough to spend on an extravagant celebration. We proposed a reasonable budget, enough for a beautiful but not excessive ceremony. Prue was furious. She screamed that we were ruining the most important day of her life, that we had never done anything for her, that we owed her for all the years of emotional neglect. Leroy tried to calm her down, but it was obvious that he too was frustrated with our stinginess. In the end, the wedding was exactly what Prue wanted: lavish, expensive, with 100 guests. We spent almost all of our savings, saving only a small amount for a rainy day. Noel even took on an extra part-time job to cover the expenses. I remember him saying, "This is our only daughter. Let her have the day she's dreamed of." After the wedding, Prue and Leroy moved to the Chicago suburbs. They bought a house, big, modern, in an upscale neighborhood. We wondered, where did the young couple get the money for such real estate? Prue explained that they took out a mortgage, that Leroy's salary allows to make such investments, that it is a profitable investment. The next few years were relatively quiet. Prue worked in real estate. Leroy had a career in insurance. They would visit for the holidays, talking about their successes, their travels, their plans. Everything seemed prosperous, but then came the year 2008, and everything changed. The economic crisis, the collapse of the real estate market, mass layoffs. Prue lost her job. Leroy's business also suffered. People were saving money on everything, including insurance. Their house plummeted in value, falling below their mortgage. Prue called in tears. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. The bank was threatening to take the house away. Credit cards were maxed out. They needed help, urgently, immediately. Noel and I discussed the situation. Our savings were modest, but we could help, not solve all their problems, but at least give them a break. We sent them the money with the stipulation that it was a loan that they would pay back when they got back on their feet. Prue was grateful, promising to pay back every penny with interest. But as time went on, there was no talk of repayment. When Noel gently reminded her of this, Prue took offense. "Do you really count every dollar you give your own daughter?" she asked. "We're still in a tough spot. As soon as things get better, we'll be sure to pay it back." Things never got better, at least not according to their stories. Every time we talked to them, there were new problems. A car broke down, a roof leak, medical bills went up, and each time they came to us for help. We helped as much as we could. Noel even put off retirement for a few years to continue to support them. I was tutoring part-time even though I was retired. We cut back on everything, denied ourselves little pleasures to be able to help our daughter, and then, by chance, we learned the truth. Noel's brother Harold was passing through Chicago and decided to drop in on Prue and Leroy. They didn't know he was coming. He wanted to surprise them, and he did surprise them, not them, but us. Turns out Prue and Leroy weren't poor at all. Their house had been recently renovated. There were 2 new cars in the driveway. Inside, expensive furniture, appliances of the latest models. Prue bragged to Harold about her designer clothes. Leroy, a collection of expensive watches. They talked about a recent vacation in Hawaii, about plans for a trip to Europe. When Harold, surprised, mentioned that we had talked about their financial difficulties, they laughed. "Oh, that's just my parents dramatizing everything," Prue said. "We're doing just fine." Harold was shocked. When he got home, he immediately told us everything. Noel and I were devastated, not so much by the loss of the money, although the amount was significant, but by the realization that our own daughter had been deceiving us, using us, manipulating us for years. Noel called her, demanding an explanation. Prue first denied everything, then accused Harold of exaggerating, then finally admitted, yes, they hadn't been completely honest about their financial situation. But was that such a terrible thing? Aren't parents supposed to help their children, no matter what the circumstances? Don't they deserve a good life? It was a turning point in our relationship. Noel, usually soft and prone to forgiveness when it came to Prue, was adamant this time. He said he wouldn't give her another dime until she paid back everything she owed. That he wasn't so much disappointed in her deception as in her attitude, her complete lack of remorse or understanding that she had done anything wrong. Prue took offense, of course, accused us of being petty, of lacking parental love, said we'd always cared more about money than her happiness, that if we treated our own daughter that way, we shouldn't expect her to care when we were old and needed help. This was the last serious conversation between Noel and Prue before his illness. After that, communication became formal. Birthday and holiday calls, infrequent visits, superficial conversations about nothing. We tried to maintain a semblance of a normal relationship, but the crack was too deep. And then Noel started having health problems, small at first, then more and more serious. And Prue suddenly reappeared in our lives, a caring daughter, concerned about her father's health. She called every day, came by with gifts, offered to help. I was grateful, of course. I thought maybe she had changed, realized the value of family relationships. Maybe the fear of losing her father made her reevaluate her priorities. Only now, after everything that happened, I realized it was just another role, another mask. She never changed, just her goals were different. She used to want money for expensive clothes, a wedding, cars. Now she wanted a house, an inheritance. I always wondered where she got this greed, this unquenchable need for money and status. Noel and I lived modestly but comfortably. We never worshiped material possessions, never aspired to luxury. Maybe that's why. Maybe she always felt she deserved more than we could give her. Or was it her surroundings? Friends from rich families, guys with expensive cars, glamorous magazines that created the illusion that happiness was measured by the price of a purse or a watch? I don't know. We may never know what went wrong, where we made a mistake in her upbringing, but one thing I do know is that Prue and Leroy are desperate right now. That explains their persistence, their willingness to commit forgery, to deceit. They need money, urgently, immediately. I found out about it by accident, a few days before Noel died. Prue thought I was asleep when I was on the phone in the hospital hallway. I stepped out of the room to stretch my legs and heard her excited whispering. I need more time, she was saying. I'm working on this. No, you don't understand. My father is dying. I can't just demand money right now. The house is worth a lot more than our debt if we sell it. Yes, I know about the interest. I'm not an idiot. Just give me a month, 2 months tops. I'll sort it out. I quietly went back to the room, not wanting her to know I'd overheard. But the conversation kept bugging me. Who was she talking to? What kind of duty was she talking about? Why was she so desperate for money? The answers came after Noel's death. When I was organizing his papers, I found an envelope addressed to him from Detective Malcolm Pierce. Inside was a report that Noel had ordered shortly before his illness. According to the report, Leroy Barkley was not the successful insurance appraiser he appeared to be. He'd been involved in several dubious payout schemes, been fired from 3 companies for ethics violations, barely escaped criminal prosecution. He was now self-employed, but his business was on the verge of collapse. What's more, he was in serious debt to several creditors, including a man named Vincent Kowalski, known in certain circles as a loan shark with harsh collection methods. Prue was in debt too. Credit cards, consumer loans, unpaid taxes. She and Leroy had already restructured the mortgage on the house twice, but kept missing payments. The bank was threatening to foreclose on the property. That's where this urgency came from, this willingness to go on a crime spree. They were desperate for money, not for a life of luxury, but to avoid collapse, perhaps even physical violence from Leroy's creditors. This information explained a lot, but changed nothing. I couldn't let them take possession of the house, of Noel's inheritance, even knowing the danger they might be in. It was their choice, their decisions that had led to this situation. I was sitting in the kitchen with the detective's report in my hands when the phone rang. It was Wesley, Muriel. His voice sounded concerned. Pru has filed a petition with the court. She's contesting Noel's will. I sighed. It was to be expected. On what grounds? She claims that Noel was incapacitated when he signed it, that you and I pressured him, and she has witnesses, a doctor who supposedly examined Noel the day before the signing and found him confused. That's a lie, I said firmly. Noel was completely lucid that day, and no doctor examined him except Dr. Mitchell at the hospital. I know, Wesley agreed, but this is a serious accusation. We need to prepare for a trial. I stared at the detective's report. Maybe that was my trump card? Proof that Prue and Leroy were desperate for money, that they had a motive for forgery? Wesley, there's something else you need to know, I said, and started telling him about the report I'd found. When I finished, Wesley was quiet. It might be useful, he said finally. But be prepared, Muriel. It's not going to be a pretty battle. Prue won't stop until he gets what he wants, or until she loses it completely. I know, I replied. I'm ready. I hung up the phone and sat for a long time, looking out the window at the garden that Noel loved so much, the garden he would never see again, the house he'd built and maintained all his life. All of this was now a battlefield between me and my daughter, a battle I hadn't started but was determined to win. I knew Prue was unstoppable. Her financial situation was desperate, debts mounting, creditors breathing down her neck. She would fight to the end, using any means necessary, lies, forgery, manipulation, like she'd done all her life. But now I saw through her. I saw her true nature hidden behind the mask of a loving daughter, and I was ready to confront her, to protect what was rightfully mine, what Noel wanted to leave me. This wasn't just an inheritance battle. It was a battle for truth, for justice, for the memory of a man who loved us both, but whose will one of us had tried to twist for her own gain. The morning began with the doorbell. I'd just finished breakfast and was about to do the garden Noel's roses needed pruning, and weeds were starting to take over the flower beds. The call was insistent, almost aggressive. I opened the door and saw Nancy Hutchins, our neighbor on the left, with whom we'd been friends for nearly 30 years. Her face expressed a mixture of concern and embarrassment. She was shuffling from foot to foot, clutching a small basket of cookies, her traditional way of showing sympathy or support. Muriel, honey, she began, not looking me in the eye. How are you? Fine, considering the circumstances, I replied. Do you want to come in? Nancy nodded, and I led her into the kitchen, poured the tea, set out the cups. She still looked unsure, twirling her napkin in her hands. What's wrong, Nancy? I asked bluntly. She sighed. Prue came by yesterday. She told me something, and I don't know what to think. I tensed up. This was it. Here it came. What exactly did she tell you? Nancy looked at me guiltily. She said that you were, not doing so well after Noel's death, that you've been having bouts of forgetfulness, confusion, that sometimes you don't recognize people or forget what year it is. I felt a wave of anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. And you believed it? No, I don't know, Muriel. She seemed so genuinely concerned. She said she was trying to help, but you refuse to acknowledge the problem. Nancy, I looked her straight in the eye. We've known each other for 30 years. Have you ever noticed any signs of dementia in me? She shook her head. No, never. That's why I came here. I wanted to hear your side of the story. I told her everything about Prue's attempts to manipulate the sick Noel, about the fake will, about the real document at the notary, about the lawsuit she'd filed. Nancy listened, eyes wide, occasionally covering her mouth with her hand in surprise. I can't believe it, she said when I was done. Prue always seemed like such a sweet girl. I grinned bitterly. She's good at appearing nice. But why is she telling everyone that you have memory problems? Obviously, she's trying to pave the way for a contested will. If she can convince enough people that I manipulated Noel in his weakened state, or that I myself am unstable and can't manage the estate, she might have a chance. Nancy looked indignant. It's it's just awful, Muriel. What can I do to help? I squeezed her hand. Just don't believe her lies. And if you hear other neighbors discussing my supposed dementia, tell them the truth. Nancy vowed to support me. Her visit left a bitter taste. I was grateful for her loyalty, but disappointed that Prue had stooped to such methods. That was only the first wake-up call. Over the next week, I learned that Prue had gone around to almost all of our neighbors and old friends telling her version of events. According to her, I started showing signs of dementia shortly after Noel's death. I supposedly forgot to take my medication, left the stove on, couldn't remember the names of old acquaintances. She, like a caring daughter, tried to help, offering to move to an apartment closer to her where she could look after me. But I, in my confused mind, saw her help as an attempt to take away my home. Some believed it. Most, thankfully, were skeptical, especially those who saw me regularly and noticed no signs of my mental deterioration. But rumors spread around Danville, and I felt strange, appraising glances at me in the store, at the post office, in the park. Wesley called me on Wednesday, his voice sounding concerned. Muriel, did you hear Prue's latest prank? Which one? About my supposed dementia? No, the new one. She's spreading rumors that Noel was going to divorce you just before he got sick. Allegedly, he discovered that you were secretly spending their joint savings on some other man. I almost dropped my phone. That's ridiculous. That's what I thought, Wesley sighed. She's getting more and more desperate. That's a good sign for us. It means she feels like she's losing. But be ready for more attacks. I thanked him for the warning and hung up. Sitting in the living room, I stared at Noel's picture on the mantel and wondered what he would say if he could see his daughter trying to ruin my reputation, my good name. It wasn't so much the lie itself that hurt me, but the realization of how low Prue was willing to fall. On Thursday, I received an official letter from Prue's lawyer. It said that if I didn't agree to an amicable settlement and hand over the house and half of all of Prue's assets, they would file an additional fraud suit, claiming that I had hidden some of Noel's assets. I took the letter to Wesley, who only shrugged. Bluff, he said. They have no proof because no hidden assets exist. Don't react to it. But the hardest blow came on Friday. I was coming back from the grocery store and saw an unfamiliar car outside my house. On the porch stood a man in a suit with a file in his hands. Dash Mrs. Tackett? He asked in an official tone. I nodded, not letting go of the grocery bags. My name is Jeffrey Norris, and I'm with Elder Protective Services. We've received a report of possible abuse and financial exploitation. I need to ask you a few questions. I felt the blood drain from my face. Elder Protective Services? An allegation of abuse? This was going beyond mere rumor and manipulation. Who filed the report? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. It's confidential, he replied, but I could see in his eyes that my guess was right. May I come in? I let him in. mentally preparing myself for the interrogation. Mr. Norris turned out to be surprisingly sensitive and professional. He asked questions about my health, about who helps me around the house, about my finances. He asked if I was feeling pressure from relatives, if I had control over my bank accounts, if I had access to transportation and medical care. I answered honestly, remaining calm. Told me about the probate situation, Pru's attempts to manipulate me and public opinion. I showed my recent medical records where there was no mention of cognitive impairment. I demonstrated that I was perfectly oriented in time and space, remembering important dates and events. By the end of the visit, Mr. Norris looked a little embarrassed. Mrs. Tackett. Obviously, the allegation was unfounded. I will close this case and note that there was no evidence of abuse or incapacity for self-care. Thank you, I said. May I ask what exactly was alleged in the statement? He hesitated, but then made up his mind. It said that you were suffering from advanced dementia, that you were incapable of caring for yourself, that a notary was manipulating you to gain control of your finances, and that your daughter is trying to help but you, in your confused state, see her as a threat. I shook my head, amazed at Prue's ingenuity. She wasn't just spreading rumors. She was trying to use government services against me. After Mr. Norris left, I called Wesley. It's to be expected, he said after hearing my story. Pru goes all in, but every such attempt works against her. Now we have an official document confirming that you're fully competent. It'll be useful in court. I understood his logic, but I still felt devastated. My own daughter was trying to have me declared incompetent, possibly even placed under guardianship. It wasn't just an inheritance battle. It was an attempt to strip me of my freedom, my autonomy, my dignity. On Saturday morning, while I was drinking coffee on the veranda, watching the neighbor's cat hunt birds in the garden, a familiar pickup truck pulled up. Harold, Noel's brother, whom I hadn't seen since the funeral, got out. He looked worried. Muriel, he hugged me. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I only found out yesterday what was going on. I invited him into the house, poured coffee. Harold was a straightforward, practical man, the opposite of his soft, dreamy brother. But now, sitting at our kitchen table, he looked confused. I can't believe Prue is doing this, he said, shaking his head. After everything you and Noel have done for her? I can hardly believe it either, I sighed. But the facts speak for themselves. Harold clenched his fists. I know Prue and Leroy better than most people in this town. I've seen how they really live while they tell you tales of financial hardship. I'm prepared to testify in court if I have to. Thank you, Harold. That means a lot to me. It's not just me, he continued. I've talked to Cousin Martha, to Noel's friends at the post office. No one believes these rumors about your supposed dementia. Everyone knows what a strong, sensible woman you really are. His support was like a breath of fresh air. I'm so used to feeling under siege, I'd almost forgotten I had allies. There's something else I wanted to say. Harold looked uncomfortable. Noel spoke to me shortly before he went down. He suspected that Prue was up to something. Said he'd changed his will to protect you. He knew Muriel. He knew what his daughter was capable of. I swallowed the lump in my throat. He never spoke directly to me about it. I think it was too painful for him to admit the truth. Harold nodded. He loved her, no matter what. But he loved you too, Muriel, and he wanted you to be protected. After Harold left, I sat in the living room for a long time, thinking about Noel. He always saw the best in people, even when reality screamed otherwise. It was his strength and weakness at the same time. He believed in the good in Prue to the last, but thankfully, he was realistic enough to take steps to protect me. On Sunday, I decided to make a retaliatory move. If Prue could use public opinion against me, I could use the facts against her. I gathered all the documents, the detective's report on Prue and Leroy's financial situation, the letters from the lawyer, the social services report on my capacity, a copy of Noel's real will. I made a few copies and put them in folders. On Monday, I started my rounds. First up was Nancy Hutchins, then other neighbors, then Noel's old colleagues from the post office, my former teacher colleagues. I didn't ask them to take sides, just offered to familiarize themselves with the facts. The reaction was mostly supportive. Many were shocked at how far Prue had gone in her attempts to discredit me. Some shared their stories. It turns out she had approached them to testify about my allegedly deteriorating mental state, even offering money for correct testimony. By Wednesday, I had amassed an impressive list of people willing to attest to my sanity and tell me about Prue's attempts to bribe them. Wesley was pleased. That's great news, Muriel. Now, we not only have a defense, but also the ability to counterattack. We can countersue for defamation and attempted fraud. But the most unexpected ally is Doris Blackwell, Leroy's ex-girlfriend from college. She contacted me after hearing about the situation from a mutual acquaintance. Mrs. Tackett, she said when we met at a coffee shop downtown. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I know Leroy. He's always been a manipulator and a liar. He cheated me out of a substantial amount of money when we were dating, and I'm not his only victim. Doris told me how Leroy used his charm and lies to swindle money from women, how he was always living beyond his means, racking up debts, how he could appear trustworthy and sincere, convincing people to entrust him with their savings, which then mysteriously disappeared in failed investments. I heard that he and your daughter are in serious debt, Doris added. That's typical of Leroy. He's never been good with money, and he'll stop at nothing if it's a large sum of money. Her story confirmed my suspicions. Leroy wasn't just a weak man going along with a greedy wife. He was an active participant, perhaps even the initiator of their scheme. Or maybe it was his influence that turned Prue from just a selfish and spoiled girl into a woman willing to commit a crime for money. Doris offered her help. She was ready to testify about Leroy's character, about his past fraudulent schemes. She even had some documents, letters in which he asked for money, promising to return with interest, promissory notes that were never paid. When I got home, another surprise awaited me. There was a message on the answering machine from Dr. Mitchell, Noel's attending physician. Mrs. Tackett, this is Dr. Mitchell. It has come to my attention that a doctor, Henderson, claims to have examined your husband shortly before his death and found him incapacitated. That is a blatant lie. I was the only physician to see Mr. Tackett at that time, and I am prepared to give an official opinion as to his mental state at the time of signing the will. Please call me back. I immediately dialed his number. Dr. Mitchell was outraged. This man, Henderson, has nothing to do with our hospital. I checked. He works at a private clinic on the other side of the state. He couldn't physically examine your husband on the date in question. This is a clear attempt to falsify medical records, and I'm not gonna let it go. He promised to provide all the necessary documentation to prove that Noel was lucid on the day he signed the will, and that no doctor. Henderson visited him. What's more, he was willing to testify in court if necessary. I called Wesley to break the news. They're digging their own hole, he said with satisfaction. Falsifying medical records is a serious charge. If we can prove that Prue or Leroy were involved, their lawsuit won't just be dismissed, they could face criminal liability. By Friday, Wesley and I had amassed an impressive body of evidence against Prue's lawsuit. We had testimony about my mental health, Noel's medical records proving his capacity at the time he signed the will, evidence of Prue's attempts to bribe witnesses and spread false rumors. We had evidence of the Leroy's financial machinations, their desperate financial situation providing a motive for attempted fraud. We're ready, Wesley said, reviewing our documentation. The court hearing is set for next Thursday. I don't see how they can win, given all of our evidence. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I will win this battle, keep my house, my inheritance, my good name. But at what cost? My relationship with my daughter is irretrievably damaged. Even if by some miracle there is a reconciliation, I will never be able to trust her again, never forget how low she was willing to sink to get what she wanted. The day of the trial was unusually clear and sunny, as if nature itself had decided to cheer me up. I woke early, before dawn, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the first rays of sunlight color Noel's garden golden. The roses had already bloomed, but the chrysanthemum bushes were still vibrant with color. Noel loved fall flowers, said there was a special courage in their resilience and beauty in the face of winter. I dressed carefully, a dark blue dress with a strict cut, pearl earrings Noel had given me for our 30th anniversary, and neat makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror, a not young but still straight woman with clear eyes and a determined expression, looked back at me. Today I would fight not only for the house and the inheritance, but for truth, for justice, for the memory of Noel. Wesley picked me up at 9 sharp. He looked focused and confident, which gave me strength. "Ready?" he asked, helping me into the car. "As ready as I can be," I replied, clutching the small purse that held a picture of Noel, taken a month before he'd gotten sick. He was smiling into the camera, holding garden shears next to a rose bush he'd just pruned. I took it with me as a talisman. On the way out, Wesley discussed strategy with me once more. He spoke calmly and confidently, as if we were on our way to an ordinary business meeting, not a trial where I was to confront my own daughter. When we entered the courtroom, Pru and Leroy were already there, sitting at a table with their attorney, a young man with an ambitious glint in his eye and an expensive suit. Prue looked pale but determined. She didn't even glance in my direction as we passed, only squeezed harder on Leroy's hand, which was nervously rubbing his tie. There were several familiar faces in the audience. Harold, sitting in the front row, nodded to me with an encouraging smile. Nancy Hutchins waved, "Doctor." Mitchell nodded gravely. They came to support me, and that support was invaluable. Judge Mulligan was a tall, gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes and deep wrinkles on his face that spoke of a lifetime of experience. He glanced around the room with an attentive gaze, lingering on me, then on Prue, as if assessing us before the proceedings began. The trial began with statements from the parties. Prue's attorney, who introduced himself as Mr. Carter, spoke persuasively and emotionally. He described me as a woman who had lost her husband and was unable to cope with her grief, who had been influenced by her old notary friend to change Noel's will, depriving his daughter of her rightful inheritance. When it was Wesley's turn, he rose from his seat, straightened to his short stature, and his voice was clear and convincing. He stated the facts methodically, accurately, without emotion. He produced the original will with Noel's signature, attested by 2 witnesses. He mentioned Dr. Mitchell's medical report confirming that Noel was of sound mind at the time he signed the document. He talked about Prue's attempts to get his sick father to sign a forged will, the false document they produced after his death. The campaign to discredit me. Then the questioning of witnesses began. Dr. Mitchell was called first. He spoke clearly and professionally about Noel's state of health in the last months of his life, confirmed that on the day of signing the will, Noel was conscious and able to make decisions. The next witnesses present at the signing of the will were staff from Wesley's office, who confirmed that Noel signed the document voluntarily, without any pressure, and that he clearly understood what he was doing. Harold then spoke, recounting his conversation with his brother in which Noel expressed concern about Prue's behavior and talked about his decision to change the will to protect me. When Doris Blackwell was called in, I noticed Leroy flinch and turn pale. She recounted his past machinations, his debts, his fraudulent schemes. Finally, it was my turn. I stepped up to the witness stand, feeling all eyes on me. Prue looked straight ahead, avoiding meeting my eyes. Wesley asked me simple, direct questions, allowing me to tell our story. How Prue had begun to take an unusual interest in her father's finances after his first stroke. How I'd discovered the forged will in Noel's office. How we'd decided to update the real will with Wesley's help. I spoke calmly, unemotional, just stating the facts. When it was my turn to be cross-examined, Prue's attorney became more aggressive. He tried to confuse me, to make me contradict myself, insinuating that I had always been against her. Dash, Mrs. Tackett. His voice was sweet but with a note of superiority. Isn't it true that you've always felt jealous of your husband's relationship with your daughter? I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. Noel loved our daughter, and I loved her too. We both wanted only the best for her. We supported her financially and emotionally her whole life, even as she grew older and made her own choices, not always wise ones. I was never jealous of her father. On the contrary, I rejoiced in their closeness. Then it was Prue's turn. She stepped up to the witness stand, looking confident and elegant in a strict black suit. Her lawyer began by asking her questions about her relationship with her father, about her care for him during his illness. She answered emotionally, occasionally brushing away a tear, telling how much she loved him, how she tried to help in the last months of his life. Then she moved on to accusations against me. I had allegedly distanced myself from Noel, rarely visited him in the hospital, was irritable and inattentive. Wesley, however, was calm. When it was his turn for cross-examination, he simply asked, "Ms. Barkley, you state that your mother rarely visited your father in the hospital. How do you explain the entries in the visitation log where her name appears daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day?" Prue turned slightly pale. "Yeah, maybe I'm mistaken, or maybe the records are inaccurate." "And what about the testimony of the nurses who remembered that your mother was constantly by your father's side, while you were often away for long periods of time, explaining that it was because of work?" "I did have a job," Prue snapped back. "Unlike some people, I couldn't just sit around and do nothing." Wesley nodded, as if her answer confirmed something important. "Dash, Ms. Barkley, is it true that you and your husband are in serious financial trouble? That you have debts to several creditors, including one Vincent Kowalski?" Prue took a sharp breath, her eyes widening. "Yeah, that's irrelevant." "On the contrary, it is," Wesley objected calmly. "It concerns your motive for trying to forge your father's will. If you're desperate for money, that explains your willingness to commit forgery and lies." Prue's face contorted with anger. "You can't prove anything. It's all made up." She was always turning my father against me, always trying to control him. Her voice trailed off into a scream, her face reddening. Judge Mulligan banged his gavel. "Dash, Ms. Barkley, pull yourself together, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Leroy was the last witness, but his testimony was crumpled and unconvincing. He often contradicted himself, avoided direct answers to Wesley's questions, and generally gave the impression of a man desperate to get out of a difficult situation. Judge Mulligan adjourned the case. We stepped out into the hallway, where Harold, Nancy, and other supportive people gathered around me, expressing approval and confidence in victory. Prue and Leroy stood off to the side, avoiding my gaze, talking quietly with their attorney. An hour later, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Mulligan looked serious as he took his seat. "Having considered all the evidence presented and the testimony of the witnesses," he began, "I conclude that the will submitted by Wesley Abbott and signed by Noel Tackett in the presence of two witnesses 3 months before his death is legal and valid. Noel Tackett was of sound mind and acted of his own free will, without any coercion or manipulation. I felt the tension I had been carrying on my shoulders all these weeks begin to let go." The judge continued, "Moreover, I find ample evidence that the plaintiffs, Prudence and Leroy Barkley, attempted to forge the will and spread false information about the defendant's mental condition. These are serious allegations that could have legal ramifications." I glanced at Prue. She sat motionless, her face a mask of shock and anger. Leroy beside her looked simply terrified. "Therefore," Judge Mulligan concluded, "I dismiss the probate suit and affirm that Noel Tackett's estate should be distributed according to his last will, as stated in the will of March 15th. Court costs are to be paid by the plaintiffs." He struck the gavel, and the hall filled with a hum of voices. Wesley shook my hand, his normally reserved face lighting up with a smile. "We won, Muriel. Justice has been served." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The victory brought relief, but also a deep sadness. I'd won the battle, but I'd lost my daughter. Not today, of course, but much earlier, when she'd decided that money and possessions were more important than honesty and family ties. Prue and Leroy quickly left the courtroom without looking in my direction. I didn't try to stop them, nor did I utter a word of farewell or reconciliation. Some rifts are too deep to heal. Over the next weeks, I adjusted to my new reality. The home I had fought so hard for suddenly seemed too big, too filled with memories, both good and painful. One morning, almost a month after the trial, I made a decision. I called the real estate agent and told her I wanted to sell the house. "Are you sure, Mrs. Tackett?" Ellen asked, a young woman with an energetic voice. "After all you went through to keep it?" "I fought for the right to decide for myself," I replied, "and now I'm deciding to move on." The house was put on the market and, to my surprise, quickly found a buyer, a young family with two young children. The husband was a school teacher, the wife a nurse. They reminded me of Noel and me at the beginning of our journey. I hoped they would be happy here, that the house would be filled with new, happy memories. With Harold's help, I found a small but cozy apartment in Meadville, a town 200 miles from Danville, far enough away to make a fresh start, but close enough to keep in touch with friends who had stood by me through the hard times. The apartment was on the second floor of an old but well-restored house, with large windows overlooking a small park. The kitchen was compact but functional. The living room was bright and spacious. I had turned one of the bedrooms into an office library, where I arranged Noel's books and his old but comfortable armchair. Preparing for the move took several weeks. I sorted through things, deciding what to take with me to my new life and what to leave behind. Some decisions were easy: photos, personal letters, mementos from my travels, a few favorite pieces of furniture. Others were more difficult: what to do with Prue's baby things that I'd kept all these years. In the end, I gathered it all up in a separate box and sent it to Harold with a request to keep it for Prue if she ever wanted it. I wasn't ready to completely erase her from my life, from my history, but I didn't want these things to remind me of pain and betrayal every day either. Moving day was both sad and exciting at the same time. I walked through the house one last time, saying goodbye to every room, to the garden, to the veranda where Noel and I loved to sit on summer evenings. I knew I was doing the right thing, that this was a necessary step for my healing, but still tears ran down my cheeks as I closed the door for the last time. On my first night in my new apartment, when all the basics were unpacked, I made tea, settled into Noel's chair by the window, and watched the sunset behind the tree line in the park. There was a picture on the table next to me, Noel and I on our 40th anniversary, both gray haired, with wrinkles around our eyes, but happy, holding hands, looking at each other with love. I thought about the price of freedom I'd paid, about the home I left behind, about the daughter who chose money over honesty and love, about all the years I turned a blind eye to her manipulation and selfishness, hoping she would change, that she would become the person she could be. But I also thought about the gains, the clarity that came after all that had happened, the loyal friends whose support hadn't wavered in difficult times, the new beginning in this quiet town where no one knew my story, where I could just be Muriel, a widow moving to a new place to start the next chapter of her life. I didn't know what lay ahead of me. Perhaps new friendships, perhaps some hobby or passion that would give my days meaning. Perhaps someday a reconciliation with Pru, though I had no illusions about that. Some wounds were too deep to fully heal, but I knew one thing: I had endured. I had survived the betrayal, the struggle, the loss, and now I was ready to move on, not in the past, not in the shadow of what might have been, but in the present, with an open heart and a clear view of the world. I raised my cup of tea in a silent toast to Noel, to our life together, to the courage he'd always seen in me, even when I doubted it myself. And then I opened a book, one of his favorites, and began to read, letting the words take me to another world as dusk faded outside the window, and a new life waited patiently for a new day to begin.